The following is a QST. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. HamRadioConcepts, the podcast. A different kind of ham radio showgram. YouTube videos? This ain't it. You never know where this show will go. Neither do we, or who will be our guest. Got a comment or suggestion? Email hamradioconcepts@gmail.com. We do this show for you. Follow Ham Radio Concepts on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat, Discord, and the entire universe. For that authentic shortwave radio feeling, listen to Ham Radio Concepts on WRMI Shortwave. Brought to you in part by HamRadioPrep.com, the easiest way to study for your ham radio license. Use the exclusive code EricPodcast20 and instantly save 20% on every course you buy. And now, from the Treasure Coast of Florida, here's your host, KJ4YZI.
And welcome to the very first Ham Radio Concepts podcast. I'm super excited to do this. I am Eric Hofer, KJ4YZI, and this is the very first episode that I've ever done, and it's being broadcast to you on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and even WRMI Shortwave in Okeechobee on 9.395 megahertz facing North America and Canada, as well as 5.950 megahertz facing Europe. And I have a very special guest tonight. I want to introduce my guest with the utmost excitement that I've ever had before, because I can't believe that I've had all kinds of conversations with people, but I've met one person, this person, that is a really good friend of mine, and man, it's a pleasure to know him. Let me give you a little air check first before I introduce him, and you'll see exactly who I'm talking about.
CKLW. Big Jim Edwards at 7:27. The Pistons swing back into action tomorrow when they take on the San Francisco Warriors on the West Coast. And from CKLW, here's Johnny Nash.
And this is, let me welcome Jim Davis, Big Jim Davis, W2JKD. Hello, Jim.
Wow, what an introduction. Eric, could you do that again, please? I was just sitting here just kind of savoring the moment, man. It was, boy, I don't get to be introduced like that just every day. But, hey, it's great to be with you, and congratulations on your latest venture. I'm so excited for what you're going to do with this podcast, how you're going to spread this around the world. And you and I both believe and love this great hobby of ours. And I think the fact that we're going to be able to spread this to people far and wide is what the hobby is all about. And it's an honor to be in your presence, my friend.
The honor is mine, Jim. And for those who may not know, they may say, well, you know, because there's a lot of new people here, they may say, well, who is Jim Davis? And I gave you an air check, but real quick, for 5 seconds, just give me something that people will recognize from my videos.
Could I have more than 5 seconds?
Yo, absolutely, absolutely.
How about, and now, ladies and gentlemen, KJ4YZI, the Ham Radio Concepts. And now, here's your host, Eric, KJ4YZI. Is that what you wanted, brother?
Jim, that is so cool, man. Listen, so let me. So you're a guest on. You know, we've had dinner together. I come over to your house. You know, we know each other, but. I'm just, you know, you've helped me get the encouragement to make this first podcast, and maybe I could tell somebody for a minute that, you know, the reason that this podcast I wanted to make, you know, I've been doing, if you're new to this and you haven't ever heard of me, maybe you're listening to this on WRMI, maybe you've scrolled upon this on the podcast, wherever you listen to your podcasts. I've done, you know, multiple videos with the channel name Ham Radio Concepts, and I've enjoyed the passion of ham radio to the extent that I've made lots of videos and played with radios and played with modes and played with different things. And when it, you know, I've been licensed since 2004, and a lot of things have changed since 2004. But Jim here has been in the radio before I was even a twinkle in anybody's eye. And
Yeah, actually, Eric, Marconi and I were very close friends. I am so old, Eric, that I open my mouth and dirt falls out.
You rode the dinosaur to school, Jim?
Yep. Now I'll be okay as soon as I get my upper plate in backwards. But honestly, the one journey that you and I shared together, and you might be, by your own definition, a fairly new ham, is the passion that we have for the hobby. And understand that I was a very young ham. I was 12 years old when I walked home from junior high school, and I saw a sign on the YMCA. It said, "Earn your ham radio license." And I thought, well, that'll be interesting. I'll just check that out. And went inside, and sure enough, there was a fellow by the name of George Downs. He was a W2. I don't remember his call. And he wanted to teach young kids how to get their ham licenses. And of course, in those days, there was the novice license, and you had to be able to send and receive Morse code at 5 words a minute. So I had learned the Morse code through the Boy Scouts in those days, and I understand it's still the same, that there is a merit badge or something like that in scouting that's available if you learn the Morse code, which is kind of funny because I learned the Morse code, Eric, using what they called flashcards. Where it was like a deck of cards. It had the letter A on the front, and on the back of the card, it had a dot and a dash, basically a short line and a long line, which is probably the absolute worst way you could ever learn Morse code. But that's how I learned it, and that's how I passed my test. And I was given in those days, novices were set aside from the generals and technicians and extra licenses by the designated of their designator of their call sign. Mine was WV2HWF. The V indicated a novice, and then when I upgraded to a general, I became a WA2HWF. But it's been a long journey ever since then. I've been on the air, I can't tell you how many years, but let me put it in perspective. I got my ham radio license in January of 1958. So do the math. It's a lot of water over this old man's dam.
Yes. Yeah, I don't like to be an expert at anything, but I could try all day to be an expert, and Jim would probably know more about it because, see, Jim's he's been from one end to the other of the spectrum, and that's what I look up to because I want to learn everything. And just recently I've wanted to go back into tube radio type gear. And Jim, you were at Field Day one time last year, and you saw my tube rig, my high gain Galaxy GT550A, and you sat down, and Jim already started teaching me how to align the plate and tune the, this and that. And he showed me exactly how to tune that radio up, but I'm going backwards. But the moral of the podcast, though, is to connect with people like this and others. If you're out there and you have something that you want to talk about, email me at HamRadioConcepts@gmail.com or get a hold of me on the Discord or wherever, because I want this podcast to be something that I can learn from too. I can learn all day from Jim, and I can learn from everybody, and I want somebody to have something to listen to when they're driving down the road. This is really exciting. Jim, I'm going to ask you a couple questions, or maybe we can start, diving into this because, and by the way, if you're just tuning into this, I'm going to say this again because we're going to go off on a tangent here. iHeartRadio podcasts, you can listen to it on Spotify, you can listen to it on Apple Podcasts. So most of the big platforms you listen to podcasts, and as well as shortwave. Everybody loves traditional shortwave, and Jim's going to talk about shortwave in a minute because Jim is way well versed in shortwave. But WRMI, I took the tour with Jim, and we went out there to Okeechobee, and this is being broadcast on 9.395 megahertz to North America and 5.950 megahertz to Europe. But back to Jim here because this is exciting. Jim, I want to ask you, so in this podcast, I'd like somebody to always be able to take something away that they can learn, and also something that is just easy to listen to. So let me ask you this. You are well familiar with WRMI and shortwave, okay? Give me a story about shortwave, and this is 2022. So shortwave, some people may think, well, shortwave is gone, but what do you feel about shortwave? And give me a memory or something that you teach the people. Tell us what you think or what you know about shortwave, and give us a story.
Sure. Well, first of all, Eric, Isn't it exciting that our hobby, which has progressed and has become, we went from tubes. In fact, you mentioned your tube type rig. I'm sitting here right in front of me, by the way. My ICOM 7300 had a problem. It went back to the factory. And so I dug out of the closet a gift that my better half, Patty, K4PAG, had given me a couple of years ago. It's a beautiful 1962 Heathkit. It's the first single sideband rig ever made by Heathkit for the car. It was called the HR20 and the HX20, and between the two of them, there's 35 tubes in it. Wow. The other night, I was talking with a fellow who was listening on shortwave, and he had a National 109 receiver. That's another one that probably had 15 tubes in it. General coverage receiver, a very good receiver, made back in the late 50s. So things have really changed. I mean, when I think about, now we're able to buy some handhelds that are made for $35 and less. We have so many great digital formats, and we're sending pictures, and we're doing satellites, and I wouldn't be in this hobby if it wasn't ever evolving and ever changing. So that's one of the things I absolutely love about the hobby. But what you mentioned about shortwave is kind of interesting because about 61% of the world still does not have internet. So for many of those folks who live on the 7 continents around the earth, the way that they get the information is through shortwave radio. It's a very, very important medium. Now, I think things will change along the way, and obviously other countries, the 7 continents, will sooner or later get internet. You probably know that Elon Musk is putting up 13,000 satellites called Starlink, and that's going to really change the picture of how we get internet around the world. But for the time being, shortwaves plays such an important part in how we get the messages across to the people around the globe. And your facility right now, you and I have toured that together, and what fun that is to see 14 different transmitters on the air. Some of them are actually home built under a license from Continental, and to feed 23 different rhombic antennas with a total of 1.4 million watts. It's just an unbelievable operation, and we really savored the moment to see these water-cooled tubes that water comes into them and steam comes out of the top of them. But the thing that I'm reminded of as I sit in my office every day and I spin the knob on my little ICOM because it is a general coverage receiver, even though it doesn't transmit on some of those bands. But I frequently spin the knob, and I'm just amazed at what I'm able to come at with shortwave. But and things are changing a lot. I remember when the 40-meter ham band was actually a shared band. It was shared with shortwave broadcasters, and I'll tell you a little story that's kind of fun, Eric.
Oh boy, story time with Jim Davis. I
yes,
love
it is.
this. Go ahead, Jim.
My first ham radio, by the way, was a Korean War military surplus Arc 5 transmitter. Actually, I think it dated back to World War II. It was a military transmitter that I was able to buy at auction for just a few dollars. I built one of those Heathkit AR5 receivers, and later on I built myself an ICOS 720 and a matching 730 modulator. But I was rockbound because, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, rockbound means crystal controlled. And I was rockbound primarily because the novices were not allowed to use phone. We had to use Morse code, CW. So anyway, you couldn't use a VFO either. It was against the rules to use the VFO.
Really?
So we had a collection of crystals. So my town, Buffalo, New York, had a amateur radio store. And I don't remember the name of the store, but I used to go down there and drool at some of the ham radio equipment, the Collins, the National, the HROs, really good high equipment, Johnson transmitters and the big linears and whatever. Anyway, so I bought my crystals from the local Buffalo, New York store. And crystals were expensive. They were about $1.50 a piece, which in 1958 was a lot of money. And so I used to troll through the store looking for bargains for crystals. And there was a 40-meter crystal for 50 cents. So I said, wow, this is great, man, 50 cents. So I asked the fellow behind the counter, I said, all these other crystals are $1.50, but this crystal is 50 cents. Is this crystal any good? He said, oh, yeah, that's a good crystal. I said, can you show me? And so he put it in a rig and turned on the radio, and he pressed the key, and sure enough, there was the full power output on 7.157 kilohertz, right in the bottom of the novice code band on 40 meters. So I said, this is great. I'll take that 50-cent crystal home with me. Well, at the time I was pedaling on my bicycle. The bicycle took me to the house, and I proudly took that 40-meter crystal and I popped it in the front of my newly built ICO transmitter and fired it up, and sure enough, there it was, full power output. I tuned in on the Heathkit receiver, and sure enough, it sounded like a great strong signal. I was all set. So, the 40-meter band kind of opens up later on at night as the sun goes down. The signals start to stretch as they bounce across the ionosphere, and sure enough, there was some CW signals that were starting to come in. So I had my little rig all ready to go, and I tuned in. I tuned myself up on 7.157 kilohertz, and said, "What in the?" No, actually, it was 7.157 megahertz. So I said, this is going to be fun." So I turned on the receiver. And lo and behold, there was a broadcast station right at 7.157 megahertz. And you know what that station was?
Was it a shortwave station?
It was Radio Moscow, my friend. It was Radio Moscow, loud and proud. And I finally understood the benefit of selling crystals for 50 cents when it puts you right rockbound on top of Radio Moscow. So...
So wait, so you're saying back then the shortwave, because I know there's shortwave up in the upper part of 40 meters over .200, but you're saying back then it could be right over the top of 7.157, right in the middle of the amateur band in the U.S.?
Exactly. They were on 7.1. Actually, I think they were probably just a notch up the dial to some extent. Probably 7.160. I'm guessing is their frequency. But yeah, they were many megawatts, just loud and proud. And of course, my little CW signal with its 50 watts was going to do absolutely nothing. So that crystal went back to the next Ham Fest, where I sold it for 50 cents.
Wow, that is amazing. So someone else got that bargain and got your memories, and they got it on their crystal, and hopefully they did something as fun as that.
Yeah, exactly right.
That is cool, Jim. That is cool. If you're just tuning in, check it out. The new Ham Radio Concepts podcast. You're hearing me and Big Jim Davis, and we are talking on multiple platforms here. If you're listening to this on iHeartRadio podcast or Spotify or Apple Podcasts, a medium for me to just be able to talk to people and meet and connect and learn things and give you something to listen to without all the other stuff that may or may not be included in the videos I've done before. And also WRMI in Okeechobee. You're listening to this on shortwave, 9.395 megahertz, covering North America and Canada, and 5.950 megahertz covering Europe. And those should stay the way they are until maybe scheduled changes. And it's me and Jim talking here. Jim, I want to ask you something. Well, first of all, how do I still sound, Jim? Am I doing good on my first podcast, Jim?
Oh, Eric, you are fine as wine in half the time, brother. You're just superb. Absolutely. Marconi would have wanted it this way.
Well, for those who don't know, Jim was, maybe you can give us a quick blurb, Jim, and tell us about your history, because I'm going to ask you something, and I know you know the answer to it, and I know you can educate me and others, but before we get there, tell us about, because as nervous as I am on this podcast, first ever, I'm nervous. I've met a lot of people, but man, you are an idol to me, Jim. And I want to tell you, what was the first time you got behind a microphone on a broadcast on a AM or FM or wherever? You've been through a wide career on all kinds of radio stations. You've probably met Casey Kasem. You've probably introduced the Beatles to a live show, wherever. Give us the first time that you can ever remember, story time with Jim here, when you got in front of a microphone and you pushed that button and you were on air.
Well, it's story time with Jim here on the Eric Show. Yeah, okay, I'll tell you a little story time. Sure, my mother was a singer on the live days of radio. She was on WGR and WKBW in Buffalo. Now, obviously, I'm not this old, so I'm old, but I'm not old enough to tell you that in the 1930s, radio played a very important role in people's houses because, of course, there wasn't television, and there really wasn't any recording medium to speak of. So, this is long before we invented magnetic tape, and we had transcriptions, but they really didn't sound very good. So the average radio station had lots of employees. They were contract people who got in front of the microphone and entertained. Maybe they were doing live theater or plays or stage stuff. My mother was a singer on the live days of radio. She sang with a quartet called the Vocalettes. Every night at 7 o'clock, they would get on this big 50,000-watt AM station at 1520 on the dial, and they would broadcast up and down North America's eastern seaboard with a little show. She sang with a band, and they were very, very popular. So my mom was a star on the radio back in the 1930s, and then, of course, we know about the advent. The German folks had invented magnetic tape. First of all, they invented magnetic wire. And, I don't know if you've ever seen one of those magnetic wire tape recorders, but I call them tape recorders. They were wire recorders. It looked like a spool of fishing wire that went through a magnetic head.
Those,
and that
Jim?
was the very what's that, Eric?
Who invented those?
The Germans. The German folks really had the whole key that unlocked the door for magnetic recording. Companies like Tandberg and Studer. They made fine German cameras and things like that, and they also made beautiful recording devices that started probably in the mid 1940s, and of course then they came along with paper tape originally before we had magnetic tape that was recorded on some kind of a mylar. And the tape that we know today, of course, the recording tape was ultimately kind of a rusted color that was impregnated onto mylar. But in those days, that kind of put my mother out of a job because all of a sudden we had this high-quality recording. A very little-known fact, by the way, is that Bing Crosby, who was a famous singer back in the 1940s and early 1950s.
Yes.
They wanted Bing to do a show on the radio each and every night. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I want to record my show. And they said, no, the recordings just aren't good enough for you to have a recorded show. So Bing Crosby went out and he invested in a company called Ampex, A-M-P-E-X. Company is in Redwood, California. It went on to be the largest provider of reel-to-reel recording equipment in the world. And in fact, they made video recorders. The earliest video recorders were also made by Ampex. But very few know that the original crooner, the fellow known by his name, the crooner, was Bing Crosby, and he was the major investor that pushed forward magnetic tape. So anyway, to answer your question, I'm sorry I'm giving a long response here, but I love with the broadcasting business because of my mother. When my mother was booted out of her job because she could no longer sing live on the radio, she became a jingle singer. And so she sang commercial jingles. It was "We're off at Buffalo Raceway," and then she would sing with this group of girls and the band behind them, and so many times I was very young, and she'd take me into the studio, and I'd watch her stand in front of the old RCA 77DX microphone or the RCA 44BX, the ribbon microphones of the day.
Yes.
And she would sing these jingles, and I knew right there I was going to be on the radio. So when I was about 6 years old, my mother bought me a pair of cufflinks. In those days when a kid went to church, he wore a nice suit, even though he was 5 or 6 years old, and he had a shirt that had cufflinks on it. And
Your
my mother
Sunday
bought
best.
My mother bought me a pair of sterling silver microphone cufflinks.
Wow.
They were emulated what they had copied, the old RCA 44BX, and so I proudly wore those microphone cufflinks to church. And trust me, while the preacher was preaching, I was talking into my RCA 44BXs on my sleeves. And my dad knew that I had an interest in broadcasting, and so he did something that was kind of cool. He took the military surplus store had a closeout on a carbon microphone and some military headphones. And my dad knew that if he put a 6-volt lantern battery in series with that carbon mic and the earphones, that we could have kind of a one-way intercom. So my little girlfriend down the street, her name was Paula Carvin. She was about 6 years old. I was about the same age. And Dad hooked this little thing up where I could talk into the microphone. Paula could go down into the living room, and she would wear the earphones, and I would talk over the microphone. Now, I would listen to the radio, and I'd listen to what the announcers were saying, and I'd kind of pick up if they had any funny jokes, or they were talking about the weather for the day, or they were just doing what you and I today would think of as disc jockey work. And anyway, so I would repeat that stuff to Paula through my little military microphone and earphone setup. Now, the only way that I knew if this was enjoyable was whether Paula continued to listen to me. If Paula threw off the headset and wanted to play with dolls, I knew that I wasn't doing very good. So I would practice, Eric. I would sit there for hours and hours learning good jokes and things that I could tell Paula. So that's how it started. It turned into a career. When I was 14 years old, I lied about my age, and I got into a Cheektowaga, New York radio station where they had kicked me out 1,000 times, and the boss who ran the station said, "Kid, do you want to work here?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Well, how old are you?" And I said, "Well, how old do I have to be?" And she said, "You got to be 16." I said, "Well, I'm 16." Well, Eric, I was not 16. I was 14. But anyway, she was kind enough to employ me for 90 cents an hour and all the records I could steal. And from there, it became a career that lasted 57 years.
Wow, that is a bit, and a big shout out. When I asked you about who made that, you said Germans. A big shout out to my friend. You know who he is, Jim and Bob and Sebastian, N1FBF. Bob is from Rhode Island, and he loves Rammstein, which is a German band of mine. And there's one song from Rammstein, Radio or Radio, and I guess it's about the back in the day with the Germans and their radio transit. I don't know. I can't understand the lyrics in German, but I know I can rock out to the song. I know every bit of it. But I'm pretty sure it has something to do with that because what you said, that rang a bell. So a big shout out to Bob because he loves Rammstein like I do. And,
well, isn't it interesting that, it was an international hobby? I think we tribute Marconi, who was an Italian, with the first transatlantic communications. And then, of course, in terms of broadcast, we think that it came back to America in 1921, KDKA in November of 1921, KDKA in Pittsburgh became the first broadcast station to report on the Harding-Cox election. That was the year that Warren G. Harding won the election and Cox was defeated. But the results of that were broadcast on the first commercial radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's hard to believe, but radio broadcasting, commercial radio broadcasting, is now over 100 years old, and Pittsburgh became the unlikely candidate to have that first communications because we know about Pittsburgh. They call that the steel milling capital of the world.
Yes.
And of course, Pittsburgh, if you're going to make good transmitters and you're going to make big towers and you're going to make some transformers, then you need lots of steel. And so that's the real reason that Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania became the birthplace of what we know today as modern communications.
Well, Jim, a lot of people tell me, why would you, I'm not one to listen to terrestrial radio too much anymore because they play a lot of the same music and I have a wide, library of music. But radio, as a ham radio operator, radio interests me. It makes me, there's something about listening to a radio and knowing that it's being broadcast and I can receive it for free on my radio. And of course, they're still putting these things in vehicles today. So you can't say radio is dying because every vehicle in the world that's manufactured today has an AM, FM radio in their vehicle. But what do you think, being that you've been in the years of broadcasting, the years you've seen, when someone tells me that radio is gone, what is your response as a proponent in if that's the right word, in radio for 50-something years? Yes, we don't rely on radio to hear about the baseball game anymore. We don't listen, huddle around the radio for the Sunday night, whatever. What do you think about that when someone says that? Is radio really on the decline?
Boy, well, you pose an interesting thing, and I'd like to really jump into that a little bit if I can, Eric, because
Absolutely, man, absolutely.
It's a transition. I mean, let's let's talk about this. An antenna and a transmitter and a microphone is just a delivery system of getting the product to the people, okay? In the 1400s, a guy by the name of Gutenberg invented the printing press. And for a couple hundred years, that's how we got the news, from Gutenberg's printing press. The printing press evolved and it became different. And then someday somebody came along with set type that could machines that could set type instead of doing it by hand. And then after that there was automatic devices, and print changed the way that it was delivered, but it was still the same product. It was just delivered differently. And okay, so AM and FM terrestrial radio, I guess that's kind of where we've stumbled across, is really just that. It's just a delivery system. It's no different than the paper that the newspaper is painted on. So think about this. Okay, radio will evolve, but the bottom line is lots of printed product has gone away over the years. The Saturday Night Post doesn't print anymore. Why? Because the product was obsolete. So here's what I believe, that radio will continue to thrive as long as the product content is good. And what I mean by that is that, you and I probably have favorite DJs, or we had people that we enjoyed listening to, or maybe we had favorite TV shows. If those products continue to be good, they'd be on the air for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, or even more. So I say that the challenge to all of us who love radio, and I'm certainly one of those, is keep the product good, and the product and the people will listen, and that means invest in the product. If we're going to have the great radio stations, then we're going to have stations that do research. They will research to make sure that they're playing the proper music. They'll do fun promotions. They'll do good contests. They'll have great music. They'll have great news. They'll hire and pay good personalities who are entertaining, and they'll go out in the community and they'll become not just a broadcast station, but a station that listens to its audience and considers themselves to be a crowdsourcer. The best communicators in the world are the disc jockeys that really listen to their audience and let their audience play a premier part in that. Now, we've gotten away from that primarily because of big companies. We have huge, monstrous broadcast companies that I think there are about, I don't know, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 FM stations and about 3,000 or 4,000 AM stations. There are a total of 14,000 broadcast licenses in the continental United States.
Wow.
So the question is, as the pie becomes smaller and the slices become thinner, who are the ones that you're going to choose? You're going to choose the ones that have the best product. I'm proud of what you're doing on this podcast, Eric, because I think it gives amateur radio operators like you and me a visible platform where we can become part of their community and they can become part of your community. And as long as we continue to offer good product and we research it, we listen to them. You want to know what's right or wrong about your product? It's very simple. Listen to the people. Your people will tell you what they like and what they don't like. If you were going to be the Ford Motor Company and you were going to roll out a new car, you would probably want to do that through some kind of advertising. You'd advertise it on television or you'd advertise it on radio. And chances are you'd invest a tremendous amount of money in making those commercials. Well, those commercials would never get on the air until they ran sample tests of those in certain markets, and people said, "Oh yeah, I love that commercial." Well, then that commercial would air. Otherwise, they'd discard it. Think of McDonald's when they roll out McRib. It's not in New York City. It's in some tiny little city in the middle of nowhere where they test the product. They see if the product flies, and if the product flies, then they roll it out nationally or internationally. So I think the same thing is true. Let's continue to research the product. Listen to the listeners. They will tell you what they like. And as long as they do that, AM and FM or whatever the medium is will not die.
Well, Jim, before I ask you when's the last time you've had a McRib, we're going to go back up here a second. but listening to the audience, that's perfect because it's a good segue. I want everybody listening, if you're listening to Shortwave, do me a favor. I want you to listen to this if you're listening to us on Shortwave. Go to HamRadioConcepts@gmail.com or send an email there and tell me in the email subject, signal report, your signal right after that, and then the location. And in the body of the message, show me a picture or where you're operating. If there's somebody that's operating on the top of a mountain in Saskatchewan with a coat hanger listening to this when it's 40 below, I want to see that. And I'd love to show everybody or tell everybody on the social media or wherever what you're operating on. So send an email to HamRadioConcepts@gmail.com, and in the subject just put signal report, space, the signal that you're receiving this on, space, and your location. And in the body, go ahead and put the picture if you got. I'd love to have that on the wall. And Jim, what I thought about doing was I was going to have like a thing on the wall, a cork board with a map. And every time someone sends an email, because there's going to be a lot of people that are listening that are in Texas or Oklahoma or wherever, but I'll try to put a pin every time. And Jim, could you imagine that board over time between Europe and North America? There'd be a pin for every person that says they're listening. That I think that'd be pretty cool to hear, who's listening to this broadcast on Shortwave.
I think that's wonderful. The bottom line is that very few listeners ever respond. They say that if you get a piece of direct mail, they say that for every piece of direct mail that you get, that there's about 1,000 people out there who aren't writing, they're not responding. So if you want to help this grow, and I think most of the folks listening to this would love to see it grow, then your idea of having audience participation is terrific. I guess I should mention that I happen to know that HamRadioConcepts is all one word, and it has an S at the end of it, HamRadioConcepts@gmail.com. I'm going to send an email right now so I can be a pin in your map, buddy.
You will be the very first pin, sir. You are a staple in this. And for those listening, if you've just tuned in, you can listen to this on podcasts across multiple platforms, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on WRMI Shortwave. Give the people at WRMI an email and tell them, thank you for letting me buy this time slot, and tell them what you think about the programming. Does this work for you? Is this great? Do you think this is awesome? Shortwave needs to have even more people broadcasting their voice and having a part in this. You can email them. The link is going to be on my social media and in the videos. But you can listen to this at your leisure. When you're driving, I found myself, Jim, lately listening to podcasts from other people. And it's not necessarily ham radio. It could be podcasts on people that are outdoors people. I love the people that go out and they go on a sailboat and they travel 40-something days and they're away from everybody. Now, that's scary to me. I couldn't imagine doing something like that. But they document all this and they podcast it and they go once a week. And I'm late to the party. This is 2022. Yeah. I'm late to the party on a podcast. But now I've seen why people do podcasts and what I've had a notion when I wake up in the morning. Wow, I want to do this, I want to do that. And I think that's more important to me than just throwing a podcast out because I feel like I have to because everybody else is. But I was saying that, Jim, I'm going to swing it here for a second to ham radio because I know there's a lot of ham radio people listening, and we've talked about this before. I know a little bit about it, but I know that, like I said, this is the part now where I want everybody at the podcast to take something away from this. Take something away from listening to this and learn about it. Jim, you remember Digital Radio Mondial. I know you're familiar with it. I know you know a lot about it. And I had a radio several years ago that was made by one company or another, whatever. And they had a native mode in the radio, DRM, Digital Radio. I called it Mondial, and you said Mondial. Now, I started researching it. Then I called you, and we talked, and I was at your house, and you showed me something. Let's tell them for a minute what DRM is and teach them and encourage them on, make it interesting on why they would want to go out and check this mode out, where it's been, how long it's been around. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, Eric, I think a couple of things are interesting. First of all, you and I are a few decades apart in age, but as we both progress in this hobby, we've both discovered that there's amazing software developments, and that's what's making this hobby exciting for young people. I have a grandson who's now 13 years old who just got his ham radio ticket. And he did that because of the digital side of it. He absolutely loves the digital toys. Now, of course, when I got on, we had we had AM radio and we had Morse code. And that's when I started in the amateur radio end of things. But think about this. every one of us has some kind of a mode that we know about, that we enjoy, that maybe isn't totally shared, and that we could share with people and they would become fascinated by it. In other words, if I said to you Easy Pal, you'd say, Jim, what is Easy Pal? Well, it is a digital picture mode. We all started with slow scan television, and fortunately for all of us, we can still watch slow scan television on 14.230 megahertz, and we can see those slow scan pictures. But of course, there's lots of other forms of slow scan now that are much better. And EasyPal is a wonderful digital mode. It's broadcast at 14.232, I think is what it is. And it's a free software for really high quality. It's images that are error checking. So if you mix a portion of the transmission because of a fade in the audio, it'll come back and repaint it. And these pictures, they look like the quality of a 35 millimeter slide. They're absolutely spectacular. So, we've played around with some of the digital formats. Like, as an example, another really good one is Free DV, which stands for Free Digital Voice. And we all know that there are some very pricey digital entries. You can get into D-Star as an example, or DMR, or you can get into some of the other forms of digital broadcasting. But Free DV is a piece of software that you can get that allows you to do low band, high quality, sounding like studio quality, just like we're sounding right now, over the ham bands. You don't have to be on sideband. You can be on digital modes, and the quality is just magnificent. So you discovered one of these, Eric, and that's DRM, Digital Radio Mondiale. And that's been around in Europe for some time. This is a really cool format. There's lots of software decoders out there that are free to the public. And if you're a shortwave listener, you might like to play around with DRM. So how does this work? Very simply, we know that shortwave tends to have fading to it, right? So the signals go up, they go down, depending on how the signals are getting to your home through the ionosphere. So Digital Radio Mondiale works like a sliding scale. If, for instance, the signals are 20 over 9 and it's just barreling into your QTH, then you get the quality that's like FM stereo. It's absolutely spectacular. It converts the shortwave signals to this high fidelity, almost FM or CD-like quality. Now, as the signals start to fade a little bit and they go down in the mud, rather than resolve back to analog, the digital the quality decays just a little bit. You really don't even notice it. It's like it goes from being high quality CD quality down to something more like dial-up, but it's still digital. And as the signals come back, that quality signal is restored as the high quality digital. So that's just one of there's probably 100 of these. If you just search for some fun ham radio software toys, you will find lots that probably we aren't mentioning. I'm glad you mentioned that one, because that's a whole lot of fun. And who of us hasn't messed around with doing some kind of some either satellite tracking, or maybe a WeFax, the weather fax that's sent from the government GEOS satellites, so that we could paint pictures in our own bedroom and print them out on what the United States Weather Bureau is seeing. The same stuff. So all of this stuff is available. It's just a matter of kind of seeking it out. Bunches of fun.
Yes, it is. And I started playing with it. There's a lot of digital modes. And in fact, a lot of people new to ham radio, if you're new to ham radio, you may think that all you've heard of is FT8 or JT65 or JS8 call or FT8 call. There's a lot of digital modes, people that like me and Jim have used, that are, stuff like Thor and Throb and Domino X and MFSK 144 and PSK and RIDI. Jim can probably tell you all about RIDI back in the day when they used to use, actual teletype machines. But then you got other stuff like Hellschreiber. Are you familiar with Hellschreiber, Jim?
No, I'm not, Eric.
Oh, you're not. You're not.
No. But I'm reminiscent of that old teletype, the old Model 19 teletype. We all think about that clanging sound, the clunk, 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 of the 60 word per minute teletype that was in every newsroom in America. But tell me about, what is it, Hellfire?
No, it's Hellschreiber, Schreiber. And basically, so here's the cool thing about this. This is one of my favorite modes, is Hellschreiber. And the reason is because, Jim, normally when you go on, I usually use Digital Master 780, and other people use, FL Digi and all kinds of other different digital decoding programs. Normally, it takes the sounds and it produces characters, okay? But Hellschreiber was developed by a man named Rudolf, and I'm trying to think of it as Rudolf Hell or Rudolf Hellschreiber, but he invented this, and basically it had its own redundancy on the same tape. So check this out. If I can explain this over radio, when the signals come in, it would draw it on paper. And
wow.
The way it drew it on paper, it had an angle on it so that if there was any sort of errors, from my understanding, if there was any sort of errors or loss or whatever, basically, let me rephrase this. I don't know much about the Hellschreiber machine back in the 30s or 40s, but what I know on Digital Master 780 or other programs that decode Hellschreiber, they have Hellschreiber nets and stuff, and basically instead of looking at the screen with a box of the letters being typed, it produces this artificial tape, and it actually prints the letters, which are all in caps, on this tape, and if there's noise, the noise is printed with the tape. So basically, when the signal starts to drop out, you'll see static, and you have to look at the screen and decode it with your eyes, and decode it and see, wow, okay, the signal faded. I think that's a KJ4YZI, and you can see it in there. But I guess back in the day, it printed it out on tape, and then you'd look at this tape and you'd see the message. But nowadays, because this is 80 years ahead of the time, they don't just keep the mode and make it where it prints text on the screen. It actually makes this artificial tape-looking screen, and it'll print it out there. And if the signal drops and fades out, you have to use more of your eyes and mind to look at it and determine what the person was sending, rather than just seeing a bunch of scrambled characters like PSK or other modes would do. And it makes you look at it and say, wow, I think that's an FT4. I think that's what he said. But Hellschreiber goes way back from the 30s and 40s. I made a video on it. There's a video, if you're not familiar. Ham Radio Concepts podcast here started with YouTube. On YouTube with videos, you can search Ham Radio Concepts on video on YouTube and see all the videos. And you can type in Ham Radio Concepts space Hellschreiber and see exactly the video I'm talking about. If you're new to this podcast, you can go to Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, or you're probably listening or you want to listen on WRMI, 9.395 megahertz facing North America or 5.950 megahertz facing Europe. But Hellschreiber, that's the mode of the week, Jim. We're going to call that the mode of the week, Hellschreiber. Everybody has to go out, watch the video that I made, look at it, research it. This man has been gone a long time, but he's making something, or he made something that I'm currently still playing with. And even at low power, Hellschreiber works great.
Eric, I'm just thinking here, I'm thinking out loud for just a second. And, wouldn't it be fun if all of your listeners, I'm guessing that everybody who's listening tonight has a favorite piece of ham radio software that we don't know about. And why don't you ask your listeners if they would email you with their very, very cool pieces of software that they like, and maybe you could collect them together. It sounds to me like that might be the making of the next Ham Radio Concepts podcast, that you could talk about some of the cool new software programs that you learned through your listeners.
And this is exactly why I had Jim on as the very first episode. And I'm super excited to give me the stamp of approval, because he's absolutely right. I need ideas. I need things to talk about. I don't want to drone on to everybody listening. I want to talk with you. You may have seen a recent video where I said I want to make a podcast. I like to learn as much as you do, and I bet you Jim could even tell you, he's been in the radio longer than I've been alive, and I bet you Jim, do you still like learning stuff?
Oh, I have to say, I'm gonna tune into that piece of software tonight, Eric. In fact, I'm not anxious for this to end, but I will tell you this: as soon as we're off the air together, I'm gonna go check out Hellshiver because I'm gonna be messing with that tonight. So, yeah, I love to learn stuff. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, life is a learning process, and radio, ham radio, is one of the last of the great apprenticeships where we learn something and then we pass it on. And so that's what we're doing tonight. We're learning and passing it on. I think that's terrific.
That is, and we don't have much time left, Jim. I know we're trying to, I asked you, I said, hey, would you get on the podcast with me and give me an hour? We're at 48 minutes, and everybody, I want you to also send a thanks to me in the email for Jim, because I want everybody to tell me what you thought about this first podcast, because the honest opinion or the honest fact is, without Jim, I would have been super scared and nervous because I'm a human to do something like this. Jim made this so comfortable for me. Jim made this so fun and exciting that I already am thinking about next Sunday, and I haven't even got done with this podcast yet. So Jim is amazing. Yeah, that is a great idea. If you're interested, if you're into digital modes, a lot of people, Jim could even attest, a lot of people are into FT8. A lot of people are into JT65. That's great. Actually, Jim, I'm going to be doing a JT65 or JT9 project from my backyard with my ICOM 705 with a high-gain 34-element UHF beam on a tripod, moon bounce. Okay.
Wow.
I'm going to do moon bounce in the backyard because people said you can't do it. Now, I know I can do it because people have done it with 3-element Yagis, and that is the final frontier as far as I'm concerned on ham radio, is to bounce a signal off the moon. And for those who are listening, if you're not familiar, you may have used JT65, which was developed by the man who made FT8, okay? But JT65 and JT9 was originally developed for moon bounce because you have to have a very, it takes 45 seconds for one-way transmission, and that 45 seconds includes your call sign, your signal report, and your grid square. But it's a very efficient mode that will work with absolute zero signal under waterfall and still give you results on the screen. So I'm going to do that. But if you have an idea or you want to talk about something as far as digital modes and the software that you use, there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm only using Digital Master 780, which originally was included with Ham Radio Deluxe, and the creators of Ham Radio Deluxe, HRD. If you have something different and you want me to check it out, please send me an email, HamRadioConcepts@gmail.com. I'd love to learn about it. Give me some info. Drop into the Discord channel. The Discord channel, if you type in Ham Radio Concepts, Discord is kind of like, Jim, have you ever heard of Discord?
No, I haven't, Eric.
Okay. Discord, and this is new for me, although it's not new in the world because other YouTubers have been doing Discord for many years. Discord, for me, it's if you're listening and you've been in computers back in the day, IRC, Internet Relay Chat. You remember IRC or MIRC?
Sure.
And okay, so it was a place where you had chat rooms and people could chat. Then they came out with colored font, and this is talking back in the early 90s. Well, Discord is kind of like that, but now you can have different rooms. So on my Discord, I have a room for voice chat, and last night, Dan and Randy and Matthew was in Australia. We were in there, and Jim, we talked for an hour and a half, and we were just shooting the breeze. And I said, guys, this is what I like. I like just talking to people like human beings, relating with radio, and everybody's got their own opinion. There's no right or wrong answer. But if you want to join a Discord, search Ham Radio Concepts. If you want to look at the other social media, Ham Radio Concepts on Facebook, Ham Radio Concepts on Twitter, KJ4YZI on Snapchat, all kinds of ways to connect to me. But send me an email, hamradioconcepts@gmail.com, and tell me about the mode that I may not learn about, because I want to learn about it. Maybe I don't know about it. And maybe if you're interested, I'll have you on. We could talk about it. We could do this like I'm doing with Jim. We could, talk about what it is, and you can explain to people and give your voice to the world on what you're doing. But what do you think, Jim? Listen, how am I
feel
doing?
like I feel like I just went to college tonight here, Eric, because you've turned me on to some new toys, some new fun things.
Jim, Hellschreiber. You have to look up Hellschreiber. And there's nets for Hellschreiber, right?
Yeah.
So these guys are on, and you can go to this website, and they have a Hellschreiber net every week, one day a week, and there's a chat room. So you tell people what frequency you're calling on. One time I got on there, and it turned into there was 9 of us talking. And again, Jim, listen to this. You're not talking to people, watching them type letters in a box.
Right.
Someone's transmitting, and there's a ticker tape going, and it's drawing it as if it was a facsimile type teletype machine drawing on a paper, and you got to read this. And when the signal fades, the mind and the eyes come together to make more sense on what you think that was. But there was a net, and we went on for hours and hours, and this was awesome. I thought that was the greatest thing. So your homework tonight, friends, Hellschreiber. Hellschreiber is something that you need to pay respect to this guy who made this years ago. Go online, check out what digital mode or what digital software that you use if it supports Hellschreiber. And then maybe we'll have a Hellschreiber net. Jim, what do you think? I should make a Hellschreiber net.
I love it, man. Well, in fact, as we're talking here on the radio, I just brought it up on my phone, and as soon as we end here, I'm going to go play around with that. So you turned me on to something new tonight, Eric. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, Jim. And we're going to wrap this up here because so what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it up with Jim because I know he's done. And then I'm going to give you a final couple of minutes of words. So here's my wrap-up. This is my 1-minute wrap-up on my very first podcast. Jim, it means the world to me, Jim. I've met you years ago. People have seen you in my videos. They've heard your voice on my videos. It puts a tear in my eye to know that I'm your friend. You, my friend, I wish I could sit and talk with you about all these stories. It's kind of like knowing my dad. When my dad was alive, he'd have all these stories, and my grandfather. You, Jim, you're exceptional, man. I thank you so much, really, from the bottom of my heart, for being a part of my very first podcast and to entertain whoever's listening. You really made my night, Jim, and I want you to give a final salute real quick. You got a minute or two, however long you want, Jim. Thank you so much for what you've done tonight, and give me the stamp of approval if you want, and let me know where you think this podcast is going, Jim.
Well, Eric, life is an interesting journey, isn't it? I mean, we all start off on this thing without a map, and somewhere along the way, we put all the pieces together, and we're somehow able to make this crazy thing called life work for us. And along the way, we're able to, somebody described it kind of like a train. Along the way, there's stops along the train, and you're able to have people who come on your train, and then unfortunately, some of those people leave your train. But I'm always thankful that you have been a part of my train. And I just think when I look back at what happened to us, how we got together originally through the amateur radio group in Vero Beach, and I believe that there are no accidents, and I think that from a spiritual standpoint that God puts good people together, and I think that we've been fortunate enough to be able to enjoy each other's friendship, our company, and our wives, and for the fact that we've been able to share camaraderie, and I learn from you, and like I said before, our obligation is to pass it on. And so you're on a new venture tonight. Tonight is the first venture for you, and new beginnings are always a little bit scary, and at the same point they're always really exciting because you never really know what's going to happen. How are things going to go? I can only say that if this is the first of your efforts, I hope that people will bookmark this show week after week after week. The great thing about podcasts, you can listen anytime, anywhere, at your leisure, and you will hear great content from a great teacher. I've watched you teach people over the last few years. I know that what you do is at the top of your game. I thank you for giving. So many people who are involved in ham radio, they're takers, but they're not givers. You're the giver. Thank you, buddy. It's an honor to be on your show tonight.
Thank you very much, Jim. I guess so. That's final. I get the seal of approval.
Absolutely, 150%, my friend.
Jim, I like to focus on one thing in my hand, and that's your seal of approval. I want to thank everybody for listening. And again, to wrap it up, you're listening to this HamRadioConcepts podcast on WRMI Shortwave at 9.395 megahertz, North America, 5.950 megahertz to Europe, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Jim, and it will only be official if you could please give me a 10 or 12 or 15-second outro. The people have heard your voice. Can you wrap the show up, Jim?
Ladies and gentlemen, around the world, live on your favorite medium, whether it be a computer, whether it be the radio, whether it be the telephone, whatever it is, you are listening to the one, the only Ham Radio Concepts with Eric, KJ4YZI, the voice of amateur radio. And for now, we say 73 and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jim. I love you, buddy. And thank you, everybody. Tune in next week, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on all those platforms I mentioned. You guys are the greatest. Send your comments, hamradioconcepts@gmail.com. Let me know what you think about this very first podcast. Let me know what you want to hear next. And if you want to talk about something like me and Jim did, please give me an email. We'll talk about it. 7-3, everybody. This is KJ4YZI signing off.